this guy named Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, and he creates these little packages, that confront each issue. So one that deals with California, and one that deals with fugitive slaves, and one that deals with the slave trade, et cetera. Little packages, and using voting blocks. Not able to get them all coming together, but voting blocks of Northerners to get California admitted, Southerners to get the slave trade or the fugitive slave issue, Northerners to get the slave trade and why. They did actually, solve all these issues, but not as a group rather, but as voting blocks, and they solved the problems for the moment, and it becomes known to us as the Compromise of 1850. And there's a lot of people who say, it's not the Compromise of 1850, it's the Truce of 1850, where they just barely were able to solve these major sectional issues and get away with it, of course, without bloodshed. I do want you to know that during this moment, it's the first time ever that there are Southerners, and these are people like Edmund Ruffin, who are beginning to say, hey, we Southerners should leave. This is not a good situation for us, and it's getting increasingly worse. One of the ironies of the compromise, and this is the good side of the compromise for the nation, that if the South had left in 1850, I think it might have had a better chance, of kind of surviving. But by 1860, the economic momentum, the industrial momentum of the North is such that the North really is putting itself in a position of a significant advantage, to say the least. So, but the Compromise of 1850, or the truce, this momentarily solving the problem of 1850, at least allows for the nation to continue on at that point. But as I've already told you can't solve the problem of more and more people going to the West. And the next area of focus, in terms of settlement, was in this area that we're calling Kansas, Nebraska. So it actually was a huge area. It was pretty much the northern section of the Louisiana Purchase, stretching all the way from the boundary of the Indian Territory, so that would be Oklahoma right here, up to the Canadian border. And it was called the Kansas-Nebraska area. Now, under the old notion of the Missouri Compromise line, you would say that this isn't a question, right? I told you that there's an arbitrary line that was drawn right about here, and so slavery below it and freedom above it, or non-slavery above it. But the problem was that here came California, and California obviated the line. So areas south of the line became part of a free state. So if you obviate the line for free states going south, then of course it also suggests that the line has no meaning for slave states going north. And what happened was, there began to be kind of like a competition between the North and the South. How's this all going to work itself out? And during this time, this concept began to arise, Lewis Cass and others presenting it, called popular sovereignty. And the idea was, to kind of take the burden off of the shoulders of Congress and let the local people decide, let them figure out what's going on, if they want it to be free, if they want it to be slave. But in doing so, you create a potential competition to take place. And I think the thing that's so incredible that happened in Kansas, where we really want to focus just on the area of Kansas, because that's the area of most of the settlement at this moment. And this would be like 1853 and afterwards. But it became a competition, and Kansas was colonized by Southerners and Northerners. And the Northerners who went there to hold on to Kansas for the North, of course, were sometimes abolitionists. And the Southerners who went there were dedicated pro-slavery advocates. So that means that in Kansas you had, pro-slavery advocates living right next door to abolitionists. And you want to guess what the outcome was? I'm sure you can guess. They called it Bleeding Kansas. I mean, these guys started to kill each other. Of course, there's very dramatic manifestations. The most incredible occurred in 1856 when a man by the name of John Brown, just a absolutely fanatical abolitionist and willing to kill the Southerners, to get rid of slavery if he possibly could, attacked a group of pro-slavery advocates at a place called Pottawatomie Creek. And not only did they kill the men, but they dismembered their bodies. I mean, just not just killing. When you start to chop people up, and of course, at some point, you're heading to a serious expression of pathology. But as you can imagine, the pro-slavery advocates in responding kind, they're going to start killing abolitionists if they can find them. And Kansas became just this incredible. It seems so strange. I always think of Kansas as a relatively mild place, of course, except for when tornadoes hit. Dorothy goes flying up into the sky, but and heading to Oz. But generally, Kansas seems to me kind of a mild area. But some people say that the Civil War began on the plains of Kansas in the mid-1850s, as the Southerners and Northerners start duking it out. And the political story is interesting, where Southern advocates could get together and try to force through a constitution, and the Northerners would challenge that. In the end, it really was a majority of Northerners who settled in the area, and it would move to be a free territory and ultimately a free state. But still, The controversy just generates all kind of anger and angst among the American people, Southerners and Northerners, and of course, that means it's getting more volatile, it's getting more out of hand. And it would become a foundation for, I'll tell you about just a second, the emerging Republican Party. Another thing that happened that really just, in this case, really pissed off the North was something called the Dred Scott decision, or Dred Scott case of 1856. It is a really interesting little story, and momentarily at least, Dred Scott became the most famous slave in America. And I'm not sure that's a wonderful thing to be, but he was clearly the most famous slave in America. Dred had been was owned by a family called the Blow family. He had been purchased by a doctor by the name of Emerson, and he was not only a doctor, but he was also a military doctor. So and military doctors, of course, kind of exist at the behest or at the demand of the military, and so the doctor, Dr. Emerson, he purchased Drake pretty much to be his nurse and personal manservant. And actually, I think Drake became extraordinarily skilled in his craft. But the problem is, if you're a military person, you're subject to transfer, right? And so Emerson was in Missouri when he purchased Dred, but then he was sent to Rock Island, Illinois, and they're there for a couple of years. And then he was sent into the Minnesota Territory. So he took his slave with him, and he used him as his nurse and personal manservant. And by all accounts that I've heard, Dr. Emerson pretty much just treated him like an employee, allowing him free time and doing what he wanted to do when he wasn't working, allowing him to make money on the side if he really wanted to. So, Dred's a slave, but Dred's living basically the free life in a free area. Now, Dr. Emerson ultimately dies, and that meant that Dred was to revert to those that had sold him to Dr. Emerson's family. Well, the original family, the Blow family, well, Dred, first of all, I should say this. He didn't want to become, he has to go back to Missouri, nothing he can do because he's part of the estate, but he doesn't think he should be a slave anymore. And the reason he didn't think so was because he had lived as a free person in free areas for so long that, by the fact of his presence in free areas that outlawed slavery, then he should be free, And although he couldn't bring a case himself, his original owners, the Blow family, were willing to bring a case for him, which I think, I always love to know a little bit more about that part of the story. And so the case enters the Missouri court system, and he actually wins one round of it. Though when it gets to the Missouri Supreme Court, they're going to say no. But that case ultimately gets to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. And I got to tell you, Emerson dies. It's like 10 years plus, until he finally gets to the Supreme. Poor Dred, of course, he's a slave during all this particular period. But it gets to the Supreme Court, and John Marshall is gone now. It's Roger Taney. Roger Taney was a Southerner, former slave owner, a Southerner, who was the Chief Justice. And Taney decided he wanted to take this case kind of on to make certain fundamental decisions about, the status of slavery and the ownership, the way that the ownership in slavery would function. So there's two basic rulings that come from the Dred Scott decision. And the first one was that Dred is a slave who has no right to bring a suit. Slaves are not citizens, therefore have no rights to bring suit. So right there, the whole situation is moot, And if you leave it there, you only kind of piss off the abolitionists, But he wanted to go even farther. This is Taney wants to go farther in the decision. And he says, basically, that the Constitution guarantees the rights of property to the property owner, and that those property owners should have the right to take their property wherever they want to go. Now, he never said that you could take a slave into the free areas, but he did say that you could take them it implies that you could take them into the free territory. So having a slave in the Minnesota Territory, according to Taney, is not against the law, And I want you to know that this doesn't mean that anyone's going to take their slaves to Minnesota, but it just infuriated Northerners. They couldn't believe it. They saw this as an indication of the so-called slave power, that the Southerners were so powerful and do all this kind of stuff. And I think the most important thing that's going to happen here is that it becomes another of a driving motivation for the Northerners to disavow the previous political structure that they had been existing in and introduce a new powerful party into the equation. So both Bleeding Kansas and the Dred Scott decision are powerful components of the rise of the Republican Party, which begins to establish itself in the mid-1850s, starting like in Wisconsin. But it's a very interesting beginning to spontaneous uprisings of Northerners. Some disaffected Democrats, some disaffected Whigs, others coming together. Some of them were part of the old American Party, came from the Know-Nothing, all coming together to create a new political party, which they wanted to represent their interest and their perspective. Now, two things about the Republican Party that you need to know. was that it was only in the North, you know. So this is the first sectional party. It's a major political party, stretching all the way from Maine to California, but you're not going to find that in the South at all, right? So this is a sectional party. We all know that that politically is somewhat problematic, to say the least. The other thing was that in their initial platform statement, they were openly and avowedly anti-slavery. I mean, they had no qualms. This is a major part of their platform, you know. The twin barbarisms of polygamy and slavery. So intriguingly, they kind of went after the Mormons, but they also went after slavery in a major kind of way. So we have a northern anti-slavery party that is beginning to emerge at this time. And I'm sure you guys know that that's not exactly a healthy thing as far as the nation is concerned. Among the very many things that are important about the rise of the Republican Party, you know, one that becomes critical is it begins to introduce the man of the moment. This individual was actually born in Kentucky, which I find very interesting, and his mother came from a family of slave owners. But over the course of his life, primarily in Indiana and Illinois, he would become increasingly anti-slavery. You know, there's various things, and he saw slave markets. You know, when he took trips down into the South, that he just increasingly just saw this as a really, really horrible thing, and you know, decided it was not good for America. He's not an abolitionist. He never thought that, of course, but he thought we should do everything we can to contain slavery where it is, and hopefully, in the long run, of course, it will begin to just disappear from the face of the earth. Anyway. He became a lawyer, autodidact in many ways, kind of teaching himself. It's a story that he got like a box of books or something like that, and began to read the law books as best he possibly can while he was being a merchant. Anyway, became a local politician in Illinois. Served one term in Congress as a Whig in the 1840s, and then kind of was back deeply involved, but began to emerge as a major political figure in the latter part of the 1850s. And in a very strange, ran for Senate in 1858 against Stephen Douglas, and in this really just Stephen Douglas beat him, but he made a name for himself with the power of his debates, the power of his speech, really speaking to the Northern attitudes in a very powerful way. And then in 1860, he's going to become what we call a dark horse candidate. That means that the Republican convention, there were two major candidates, William Seward, Salmon B. Chase, and the decision could not be made between the two of them, and they're going ballot after ballot after ballot. And finally, you know, because they couldn't decide between these two candidates, they're going to decide on another one, and the votes quickly turned, and they're going to turn to this man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, of course, is going to be the critical figure of this moment and through the Civil War. It is the election of Abraham Lincoln, of course, that will be the precipitating event that will lead to the behaviors, the activities of the Southerners. And, you know, it's such a strange election. There were four candidates. And only two of them even tried to be kind of a national candidate. Stephen Douglas was running and trying to reach to the South a little bit as a Southern candidate or Unionist candidate. They wanted to reach to it, but you know, Abraham Lincoln didn't even campaign in the South. He knew there was no good reason for it, and you know, a Southern candidate would do the same kind of thing. When the election finally came through, you can see the vote is just, you know, incredible kind of. So Lincoln did have 1.8 million votes, so he wins a plurality. He had more than any other candidate. But look at the opponents receiving 2.8 million votes. So you know, huge numbers of people, of course, not voting for Lincoln at all. But because of the nature of the Electoral College, the North, of course, has the population base. It will win an Electoral College, and Abraham Lincoln will become president of the United States. And what that will do, you know, the Southerners are now faced with that kind of that issue that I told you about. Their concern about the North, you know, and the North being constituted in a way that could do them damage. And you had both a Republican president and Republican majorities in the House and Senate, and that party was openly and avowedly anti-slavery. And South Carolina takes a look at that, and they said, this isn't good for us. They found out about the outcome of the vote in early December, and by December the 20th, 1860, South Carolina, evoking its states' rights, will secede from the Union, to be followed, of course, by the Mississippi and then the other states of the other states that will become the Confederacy. And then all you have to do, of course, is wait for the actual firing of a shot. And the reason for the firing at Fort Sumter was that there were federal facilities in the South, including Fort Sumter, and Lincoln had to figure out something. You know, they were going to run out of food, they were going to be in trouble, and Lincoln simply told the Southerners, you know, we are going to resupply the forts. It was not necessarily an act of war, but you know, would the South allow for the forts to be resupplied or not? And clearly on April the 12th, you know, Edmund Ruffin Shot is saying, no, you can't do that, and the Civil War began to commence. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Civil War, but I'm going to take just a little break before I do it.